to talk this morning. I thought we'd just jump on for a quick call and talk about trade because it's on the top of everyone's tongues with Vietnam and potential duties and tariffs and where we stand. So great to talk today, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, the same. It seems like every conversation we're having with everyone during the day that this always pops up. So yeah, good to share some thoughts.
So is the potential trade tariffs that Trump is considering going to impact Vietnam? Do we know?
No one knows by how much it will impact because at the moment that Vietnam's still in the universal category. It's not a country that's been targeted like Mexico, Canada, and China. It's quite interesting. Everyone's focused on tariffs now. If you look at the last 3 years across the world, tariffs have gone up. There was 19,000 tariffs a few years ago. Now it's nearly 22,000. If you look at non-trade barriers around the world in 30 key economies, right, it was like 380 or something thousand trade barriers that were put in place, non-tariff related. That's up above 430,000.
But notwithstanding all the mutual and multilateral trade agreements that have been focused on in the last few years as well.
Yeah. That's sort of what I'm getting at is it's a big thing now. I understand why, because America is such a big market. But this has been a trend for the last 3 or 4 years. The protectionists around the world. If you look at
Sorry. It's interesting. So if we look at the fear at the moment, the fear is that Vietnam has a significant trade surplus with the States. Therefore, the commentary I get from people is that it's going to be next. It's going to be the next Canada or Mexico or China. I don't have that same belief for a whole range of reasons. Do you believe that's the case?
Quite simply, who knows? But there may be an impact. But Vietnam also has diversification, which none of these other markets have. 18 FTAs, a lot of multilateral, 12 comprehensive partnerships, like 3 of those just in the last few years. They've got space to move.
So Vietnam being everyone's friend in developing those trade as opposed to Canada, which has a significant focus on the US only, it puts into a different position. But when we say, look, my belief is that one of 2 things is going to happen. Either we're going to see tariffs just thrown out there as Trump has used as a tool against a wide range of countries, and Vietnam's going to be one of those, but no different to many others. Or there's going to be the targeted tariffs, which is what we're getting a feeling that towards April there's going to be targeted tariffs where countries don't treat US fairly. And I think in Vietnam context, and correct me if I'm wrong, the treatment Vietnam has with the US is actually quite reciprocal. It's not that far off the balance versus other countries which have a far worse situation. Am I reading things right from the way you see it?
Yeah, and there's a lot of variables in that. And a big one is, with regards to that, is ASEAN in general. How important is ASEAN? Yeah. So if you look at countries from ASEAN that work well overseas, that are open to collaboration, that are open to trade, that are open to adapting for their bilateral partners, well, I would still advocate Vietnam sits on top of that list. If we look at Indonesia, they've gone down a protectionist road somewhat. If we look at the Philippines, similar exit Indonesia, there's protectionism. Similar, there's legal uncertainty. Similar, there is more regulations that make it difficult for offshore partners. Vietnam has done its best to remove all of that. So as an ASEAN bloc, it's in a better position that I would advocate for than the other countries in ASEAN.
And that's a fair point. And you look at in recent days, we were just talking before this recording, in that Vietnam is making great strides to show the bilateral relationship of its trade with the US as a defence mechanism as well, to say we're doing two-way trade. We're signing a whole bunch of agreements on both sides. There was a bunch done in the US in recent days and a whole bunch yesterday in Vietnam for a delegation to show that they are a good trading partner in that context and open. They've got, I know there was press releases in recent weeks about the Vietnam has a whole bunch of deals stacked up. The aircrafts and VietJet and Vietnam Airlines aircraft, there's a whole lot of agricultural deals. They're really trying to have every tool available to say, we're good, we're the good guys here, we're not the problem. And treat us well because we're not causing the issues. The other side to that, though, is Vietnam is not China. And if one of Trump's agendas is the anti-China agenda, you don't want all enemies. You do need some friends in that, and Vietnam is not China in that context.
Yeah, and let's not forecast what Trump's going to do or what Trump's going to think, because who knows, right? But
yeah,
at the end of the day, at some point in time, during his time as president or shortly after, someone in decision making in the White House will have to make a decision. Do they want to push ASEAN towards China or not? And that will come. And through mechanisms like this, Vietnam has shown that it wants to work with everyone. There's been many chances where Vietnam could have gone one way or the other with regards to China and America, and it's stood firm to work with everyone. So it's done extremely well.
I have a slightly different view. I don't think the current Trump regime is worried about geopolitics. They're more worried about transactional trade. So I put it in the context of, the close to China or not close to China in the political sense is not the game. It's going to be what's the transactional benefit for the US.
Yeah.
And that's where I don't think...
Can I jump in on that one? Because really interesting the last week. So Vietnam's trying to reduce the surplus with America. However, everything's a paradox. So tariffs with regards to the average tariffs now China face with America, average is at 33%, is now at 33%. Trump has a long-term view that he mentioned going up to 60% over time to roll out more and more pressure. However, every time he puts tariffs on China, in certain industries, that opens up supply chains from America to Vietnam, right? Both ways. So he gives China tariffs, China gives tariffs back to America. Next thing, everything that's exported from America to China, a lot of that now is diverted into processing into Vietnam, where Vietnam will process that and on-sell to China for China consumers, not for re-export. So in some ways that indirectly helps, but then you've got the alternative. Vietnam, ASEAN, China is the biggest FDI of deployment across ASEAN. So goods that come from ASEAN are part of a Chinese supply chain. So the paradoxes are playing out with each other all the time. That's what I'm getting at. There's no A to B solution.
And you've then got this fear, and this is the discussions we've had with a lot of clients, a lot of people who are worried, saying, China's just going to route things through Vietnam, and therefore Vietnam will punish because it's just another route to market form from China to avoid tariffs. And what we have seen in recent years, a very strong effort. We've seen it with rolled steel just recently. We've seen it with certain cabinetry and furniture that's coming through. The anti-dumping Vietnam is happy to put on at the very early stage on China bringing goods in, so it doesn't become a transshipment and Vietnam get tarred with the same brush as China. Vietnam, you can see that the authorities are very conscious of that because the authorities in the US are picking up the border and Vietnam's reacting very fast to that. So what I say is that I don't think that using Vietnam as a transshipment point, not to say the supply chains aren't strong, but it's not, Vietnam is not comfortable as a nation as being anything to avoid the tariffs that China is facing. It is simply, it is part of our supply chain. And that is, again, one of the protection measures that Vietnam is very careful to put in place to be everyone's friend and not to fall foul of, in this case, Trump's regime or any country's regimes.
Yeah, and then if you go down a bit deeper with that, part of the supply chain. So in some industries, Vietnam is simply assembly. Simply, that is it. Yeah. Now, in other industries, and this cuts across ASEAN, input materials for what countries in ASEAN manufacture to export to the world, nearly 80% of those input materials come from China. And that is the same for many, many other countries in the world. 40% of exports around the world are reliant on Chinese supply chains. That might actually be higher now. So it's a very rudimentary argument when people bring that up. However, the Trump administration seemed to look at things in a rudimentary way too. So,
because and just to elaborate on that point, you've got your trade deficit. Vietnam with China is what, 30 or 40% of the total trade deficit is China, and the trade surplus, 30-40% of the trade surplus is US. So you've got exactly right. So you've got this raw materials China. That's just a fundamental part of supply chains. And you've got US being the biggest market, and that's just part of consumption.
And sorry, to jump in with this one more, Vietnam can weather any storm. So if we go to a full black swan situation, any storm that's put on Vietnam, it has capacity. It has the capacity to weather that because of really good economic management. 34% debt to GDP. Lowest in Asia.
And that's
lowest.
Yep.
All the
economic factors are absolutely in Vietnam's favour. So I was going to touch on the fact that the big shift Vietnam to the US versus this sort of shift away from China and this mindset of China's getting too expensive and Vietnam's going to be favourable to particularly US companies. Focus on the US as one of the largest markets.
Yeah.
Now I'm talking to distributors, and I was talking to shipping and distributors in recent days, and they're saying that they haven't seen, particularly in the fast e-commerce type small package de minimis arrangements, not a big differences. Partly offset that de minimis hasn't come in yet, so we haven't seen that shift, and that the US dollar has strengthened, therefore the impact has not been as much on the duties, and they're negotiating with factories for small changes. We're not seeing big impacts yet. So financially, they're not big impacts. From a psychological perspective, it's tarnished. People are not placing orders, and they want to put it. The risk is too high. They don't want to trade with China if there's an option because of the psychological. And I think that's going to be a really big shift. Is not the economic impact per se; it's the perception of the impact and the psychological effect. And what if we get to that 60%, as you're mentioning? What happens then? So that is only to Vietnam's favour in this scenario.
Yep, and I not with any particular client, but supply chain diversification, being reliant on one market. Now we can go into that until as long as whenever, yeah. But what's the point? Japan moved out of reliance on China 2012, 2014. Everyone else just waited around, and then in 2018 and 19, they started to talk about it. Then COVID hit, and I still find it unbelievable that companies don't have a plan B and a plan C. If it's assembly related, yeah. Now, if it's input material related, it's more complex.
Well, we've seen many over the last 10 years, the China plus one diversification. We've seen in recent years, the China risk, the strategic risk. What we see in that, a lot of the US investors, they're not actually investing in facilities, they're investing in supply chains and third party. It's a laggy process. It is a drawn out process to change your manufacturing partners, where your manufacturing partners are, the supply chains associated with them. It's not like that the US brand builds their own factory in Vietnam. That's not necessarily the scenario, or they own 3 factories in China. They may use factories. It's a very long process. What we do see is where there's discretion to place orders, like top-up orders and etc., that discretion is not being applied to China quite often. But the actual supply chain takes a long time. I don't know when, and what's your view on how long do you think before we see major shifts? We're seeing constant shifts out of China as diversification. Are we going to see a wave now, or are we just going to wait and see?
Well, that wave, let's come back to the Vietnam's government's priorities, their model. Their model is the country will develop through FDI and exports. So the exports, 18 free trade agreements, 12 comprehensive strategic partnerships. They've nailed that, and they're continuing with that. Capability development. So when you're talking about supply chains, Vietnam +1, it's not resourcing, it's capability development, and that comes with FDI. Now, the complex issue here, if American companies are not deploying FDI and other nationalities are, and other companies from other regions, then the complexity is not being removed. Back to China being the #1 FDI of employment across Asia now. Yeah. So what I'm getting at is capabilities, they come with FDI. So when people want new supply chains going into America, the resources are here. Companies can set up and do that, but it's the capability lag that's missing. And that capability comes from offshore supply chains.
Okay, so just running out of time here. So I think one of the two things I'll finish up on, in my view, is that one, the focus, just to elaborate on what you're saying, the focus in the Vietnamese government is on high tech now. They've announced that, they're focusing, they've got tax breaks, their incentives for large high tech. They're trying to attract that next wave being the tech. That's what they want, and they're trying to develop supply chain. There's issues with that, but it's the absolute focus on high tech. The second thing in FDI is Vietnam has the highest proportion of any of the Asian countries of FDI to GDP. So Vietnam is winning that, and it continues to win that. That focus has worked, and it's going to continue to work. And I think that's only going to get better because Vietnam plays that game. You look at, in recent years, Vietnam's the only country in the world that's had the head of Russia, head of China, and the head of the US visit within a 12-month period, actually visit at all. It does play this political multilateral game very well, and as you say, it's an export-focused, FDI-driven economy, and that's where it stands, and it's prepared to protect that, and I think it's going to weather it. I don't think this is going to affect Vietnam more than it may affect Vietnam, but more than any other country necessarily for all those reasons we've discussed. So they're my final viewpoints. Where do you think? My summarise?
My round-off would be 15 of the US's top 20 trading partners are running a surplus with them. 15. Right. So it's when you get to universal tariffs, it's the whole world's in the same boat. Yep. Second one is Vietnam has the diversification and the debt to GDP to weather the storm and to build out from this over time. Yep. And the final point is to really, the opportunities to reduce that surplus, it may come from Vietnam talking to America directly about importing. I actually see it coming from the American side using Vietnam as a processing hub to supply the Chinese consumer market.
Good point.
China is hitting that with tariffs. Vietnam has an FTA with China. Who else has that? It's a really good opportunity for a whole new supply chain for America. And let's see, I'm putting my money on that at the moment.
And it's a very good point. And I don't think anyone can predict crystal ball, predict what's going to happen. It is very fluid, it's very reactionary, and we're all sitting in a space to see what happens next. And let's hope that we get to a more normal situation and everyone doesn't live in sort of this topsy-turvy world we've got of things changing day by day. So let's see how that goes.
Oh yeah, and sorry, my caveat to all this is that I'm not predicting. We're chatting about scenarios, and this is not about prediction.
So you're not putting $2 bet on anything here?
No. Because Trump is his own man and does his own thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, look, great to talk. It's good to jump on and have a chat with you, and look forward to talking again shortly.
Yeah, mate. Speak in a few days. Thanks, mate.
Okay, bye.